So, India has just done something massive. We're talking about one of the biggest overhauls to its employment laws in, well, decades. It's a huge shift that's set to completely redefine the relationship between millions of workers and their employers. So, what's really changing, and why now? And that really brings us to the core question, right? Why go through all this trouble? Why overhaul the entire system? To really get it, you've got to understand that India was running on a rulebook built for a completely different world. All right, so let's rewind a bit and talk about the old system. And when I say old, I really mean old. The legal framework that governed India's workforce was this tangled web of laws, and a lot of them were written before the country was even independent. Get this. A lot of these original laws were put on the books way back in the 1930s and 50s. We're talking pre-independence era stuff. And as the decades rolled by, more and more laws were just tacked on, creating this complicated mess of over 29 separate regulations. They were often confusing, sometimes contradictory, and just not built for a modern 21st century economy. A complete reboot was long overdue. So how do you fix decades of legal spaghetti? Well, you do something pretty radical. You take that whole messy pile of 29 plus laws and you boil it all down to just 4. Think about it this way. The old system was like trying to navigate a maze with more than 29 different and sometimes conflicting rule books. The government has now collapsed all of that into just 4 streamlined codes. The goal here was pretty straightforward. Make the system easier for everyone, workers and businesses alike, to understand and actually follow. And here they are, the 4 new pillars of the system. You've got the Code on Wages, one for industrial relations, a really important one on Social Security, and finally, a code that covers occupational safety, health, and working conditions. Each one of these scoops up a bunch of older laws into a single modern framework. Okay, so that's the big picture. But what does all this legal reshuffling actually mean for you, for the average person on the job? This is where it gets really interesting and starts to hit home. All right, first big thing, formalization. You know, it used to be that there was no legal requirement for every single worker to get an appointment letter. Now, it's mandatory. And honestly, this is a total game changer. Having your job terms in writing gives you legal proof, it boosts your job security, and it just brings a whole lot of needed transparency to the workplace. Okay, next up, wages. This is huge. Before, the right to a minimum wage was kind of patchy. It only applied to certain specific jobs, which left millions of people out in the cold. Under the new Code on Wages, that's gone. Every single worker in the country now has a legal right to a minimum wage, which sets a universal baseline for financial security. And then there's Social Security, which has gotten a massive expansion. The old system, it left a lot of people behind. The new Social Security Code, well, it aims to bring everyone under the umbrella. And for the very first time, that includes gig and platform workers. This means things like retirement funds and insurance are going to be available to way more people. And just to give you an idea of how big a deal this is, look at this number. Social Security coverage has literally jumped from around 19% of the workforce back in 2015 to over 64% now. That is a gigantic leap forward for the national safety net. There's also a brand new focus on health and well-being, something we've never seen before in Indian law. Employers are now legally required to give a free annual health checkup to every worker over the age of 40. It's a real shift toward promoting preventative care and making health a shared responsibility. All right, let's put a couple of groups under the microscope for a second because these changes are particularly significant for them. I'm talking about gig workers and women in the workforce. This is a really big first. For the first time ever, Indian law now has an official definition for gig worker and platform worker. Now, you might think that's just words, but it's a critical first step to recognizing and protecting the millions of people who are powering today's economy. And it's not just about a definition on paper. The platforms, the aggregators, now have to chip in, contributing a percentage of their turnover into a social security fund just for these workers. And maybe the best part, these benefits are portable. They're tied to a universal account number, so they follow you from job to job, which is absolutely essential for how the gig economy works. Now let's turn to women workers. This quote from the new code, it really sums up the whole philosophy here. It's all about knocking down old barriers and opening up doors, and this is key, with consent and safety right at the front. So let's break down what this actually means. First, equal opportunity. Women can now work night shifts or in industries that were totally off limits before, like mining, as long as they agree to it. Second, equal pay. The law is now crystal clear, no gender discrimination in wages. And third, and this is non-negotiable, if women are working at night, their employer must provide things like safe transport and security. So when you step back and look at all these changes together, what's the big idea? What's the end game here? You see, at its heart, this whole thing is much bigger than just updating labor laws. It's a fundamental piece of India's larger vision for becoming a self-reliant, modern economic powerhouse. The thinking is pretty simple. You can't build a 21st century economy on 20th century rules. So what you have here is this incredible balancing act. On one hand, you're trying to give workers stronger protections, better wages, and a real social safety net. But on the other hand, you're trying to make things simpler and more flexible for businesses to make it easier for them to grow and create jobs. The hope is that both sides rise together. And so that brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? On paper, these reforms look incredible. They're designed to build a system that's simpler, fairer, and just more modern. But the real test, of course, is how it all plays out on the ground. Will these new codes actually create that more just and productive future for India's massive workforce? Well, I guess only time will tell.